To fully understand New Zealand's soil erosion issues, it's important that we understand the history of New Zealand and the history of agriculture in New Zealand. So New Zealand's pre-settlement landscape was made up about 90% native forestry. Much of these species were vulnerable to fire, as fire was not a common cause in New Zealand. The early settlers arrived in the 13th century from Polynesia, the Maori. Maori used fire for hunting. Native birds such as moa, they used fire to drive these out of the woodland, so much of the country was already deforested before colonizers arrived. However, they were not the only ones to cause deforestation. So once colonization occurred, there was an agricultural boom. It's called the Great Pastoral Area. It's from the mid-1840s until about the early 1900s. These included expansion of sheep farming, which changed the economic base of New Zealand. It encouraged more deforestation to form grazing lands for sheep and arable land. So the pre-colonial deforested areas were turned into grasslands, productive for sheep and dairy by clearing the tussock and flax, which are grasses, and sowing of grasses such as ryegrass, cocksfoot, timothy, red and white clover, which are still found today. The land clearing continued around the country mainly by fire, as it was the only way to get rid of the dense rainforests. When refrigerated ships first left Port Chalmers in 1882, they left with butter and meat headed to Britain. So this made agriculture economically viable and really encouraged agriculture. So this is when a lot more of the land was cleared for agriculture. So what New Zealand considers the golden years is the early pre and post-war years. This is where the real agricultural boom occurred. New Zealand agriculture's golden years, 1920 to 1980. Post-World War II, there were a lot of planes lying around. They used these to spread fertilizer and seeds on land that was too steep to do with horses and tractors, which, as we now know, has led to pastoral farming on land that is really not suitable for it. More land was cleared, especially hillside bush, now that all the flat land had been cleared. And this is the land that we now understand to be unsuitable for agriculture. However, it's still farmed, but more extensively than it used to be. So then this brings up to the turn of the millennia. The turn of the millennia is when the dairy boom occurred. So a lot of this farmland that was sheep and beef farms converted to dairy, but because the boom was so great, there was more demand for more land. This, again, included more forestry being cut down and cleared for dairy land. So New Zealand's dairy herd increased by 65% in the dairy season between 1990 and 2000. Also, the land used for dairy increased by 72%. A lot of this came from sheep and beef, but some of it did come from clearing more land. The increase was possible due to the crash of the bull market, so more and more sheep farmers were going bankrupt. So why was this story important? Well, unlike Europe and Africa and a lot of places around the world, New Zealand farmland is still very young. As we see, it's early from the early 1900s really up until now. It hasn't been around that long. And therefore our soil has unique characteristics and is probably more susceptible to erosion due to its younger soil structure. So the New Zealand agriculture sector grew rapidly to become an international player it is today. From the first ship leaving Port Chalmers in 1882 to today, a lot has changed and a lot has grown. We went from being just self-sustaining to now being a huge international player in agriculture exports. But because this happened so quickly and we were so focused on improving our land, we still have a lot to learn about our land and how to manage it and preventing soil erosion. So New Zealand soil erosion happens a lot and mainly on hill country. It is estimated that 192 million tonnes of soil are lost every year from erosion. 44% of this comes from pasture, the rest is from coastal erosion and hillside erosion. And 48% of the tested sites are outside the target range for phosphorus content, which means that a lot of this phosphorus is being deposited into rivers and streams, which is really difficult to correct and really dangerous for marine life. Because of rapid deforestation, nearly 83% of our native birds, bats and reptiles are classified as threatened or at risk of extinction. The shift in the last 15 years has led to a higher number of animals farmed per hectare, especially in dairy, this is what mainly happened in the dairy boom of the early 2000s, where most farms went from being family-sized farms of 200 cows to now many farms over 600 cows. The net loss of 71,000 hectares of native cover land between 1996 and 2012. So this is not even talking about the start of agriculture in New Zealand. This is just talking about the last 20 years. There's a lot of native land cover that has been lost. Between the two islands, there's a difference in what is more likely to cause erosion. So in the South Island, soil erosion is more likely to be due to high rainfall and vulnerable steep mountain terrain, while in the North Island it is due to the historical clearance of forest on steep slopes for pastoral agriculture. And this is why the North Island for many years has been the focus for improving agriculture erosion, where the South Island has been more focused on conservation, prevention of erosion. So, as I mentioned before, 192 million tonnes of eroded soil entered rivers each year. 84 million tonnes, which is 44%, was from exotic grassland, like I talked about before with ryegrass and timothy and clover. So, grassland that comes and is used for agriculture. So, what are solutions to soil erosion? I like to focus on biological solutions because, in my opinion, they're the most sustainable and long-lasting. So we have agroforestry, which is already being encouraged in a lot of places, especially in the North Island, with the farmland erosion being a big issue. So increases hill stability without taking it out of production. This is still land that can be farmed. However, the productivity of it is slightly reduced, but erosion is also reduced. So in this case, you grow about 100 to 200 trees per hectare, and you space them out so the animals can graze between them. Sunlight can still reach the soil, so pasture still grows really well, but the roots hold the soil better to prevent erosion. So the benefits are protecting the soil from the impact of rain, and they also utilize a large amount of water, so it prevents the waterlogging of wet soils, because wet soils are a big erosion risk. As well as I mentioned before, binding soil to sloping land with their roots. And one of the big issues, and it occurs on both islands, is the gully erosion. So we can use gully erosion prevention via two different types. You've got pair planting, so you plant trees on either side of the gully about 2 to 3 meters apart, and the roots create damming effect, which slows the water down and stabilizes the gully sides. Also, the roots will grow eventually underneath the gully, which holds together the soil of the gully, preventing it from eroding even further. Or the more common one that has been seen is the gully planting, where just shrubs and trees are planted in the gullies to prevent the soil from eroding further. This is also encouraged. The gullies are now also encouraged to be fenced off, so to prevent any animals going there, so any pugging loosening of the soil because of animals is to be prevented by fencing, which I talk about later. It's called retirement fencing, but it also comes to play in gully erosion and gully planting. Another big thing is retainment fencing and riparian planting. These act as a way to slow the soil loss to waterways, as I talked about before, being a very large issue on pasture land. 44% of land being lost to waterways. So retirement fencing is the fencing of unsuitable land and letting it return to its natural state, which is often with natural trees and shrubs which prevent a further erosion, which is what I talked about. This is where gully planting comes into effect, and the retirement fencing of the gully planting to prevent further damage. Riparian planting is something that's encouraged by all farmers, and I think by law now, dairy farmers by law are required to fence off waterways and have riparian planting. So riparian planting is where for 5 to 10 meters from a waterway you're supposed to fence it off and plant natural plants like flaxes, shrubs, trees, native trees. This allows these plants now function as a sieve. They help filter out the sediment and nutrients before they enter the waterways, which also helps stabilize the land and prevent erosion, increasing the habitat for native wildlife. Another important and very commonly used function of trees in erosion prevention is shelter belts. These are rows of trees planted at angles that provide the most protection. They reduce wind erosion and protect livestock and crops. The most common species used are exotic species because they grow faster than native species. But they're usually 10 meters wide, 5 to 10 meters wide, and they're grown along fence lines throughout the farm. They offer great shelter for animals, and as mentioned before, they protect the soil from wind and water erosion. Another type of erosion control is mechanical. So those are things like how we use the soil, like cultivation techniques. Direct drilling prevents the soil to be left bare for larger times, and leaving a crop residues post-harvest so that the soil is covered. Furrows, which are channels ploughed across the slope to redirect the water into streams. There's bulldozing, which smooths the land to stabilize the soil after erosion has occurred. Flumes are directs water downhill in a controlled way, and dam is controlled water release. While these help with erosion, I feel like these are ambulance at the bottom of the hill solutions instead of fixing the problem before it occurs. So in conclusion, we need to farm land within its capabilities. Steep land should be left to forestry or to return back to native forestry. We should be using tree coverage on hills and slopes. Biological controls erosion is the most sustainable option. Trees are erosion prevention's best friend. Fencing off unsuitable land and replanting natives as they are best suited for their own soil should be encouraged wherever possible. We need to minimize wind and water damage to soil through farmland management and shelter belts. We need to minimize the length of time a soil is left bare, and we need to farm our land within its capabilities. This means not farming more than the required animals per hectare, and taking into account the climate and the weather when we farm our land. Thank you.